Welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about kind of like a random device that came out a while ago, but it's still such an interesting phone that Blackberry put out of everybody else. And this specific phone is the Blackberry Priv. Now, obviously, I wouldn't really recommend anybody buying this phone anymore, but this concept of a slide-out phone that still visually looked really good when it was closed is something that I haven't seen a lot of other manufacturers do, and I think that's why this phone was as popular as it was, and still why it's so intriguing. If you look at a lot of other Blackberry phones that came out since then, like the Key 1s and some other phones too, this phone, or the Key 2, whichever one it was, this phone still looks extremely good. And even like putting away the keyboard and everything, like even without the keyboard, it still looks visually good, which is something I'm really impressed about. Now on the front, obviously you do have a pretty decent sized 5.4-inch AMOLED panel. Now at that time in 2015 when this thing first came out, that was a pretty big screen, but it's funny because 5.4 inches now is like how big the iPhone 12 mini screen is. So it's crazy how like we've seen improvements in that sense. I don't know why I'm sounding like this today. But when you actually slide up the specific phone, you have that keyboard at the bottom. And this was my favorite part of this phone. It's crazy that back in 2015, this was like a crazy cool feature. But now this would be like a downgrade. This would be a reason not to buy this phone. Now the keyboard on this thing was pretty compact. It wasn't huge, but it did have this like, gesture design on it where you can actually, kind of move around the OS of the device by sliding up and down and side to side on this thing. It'd be really cool in like the web browser, Chrome at the time or whatever. And that was another really cool thing about it. And the crazy thing is this phone slammed down with the keyboard like I mentioned. The bottom bezel wasn't really crazy big. It did have a front-facing speaker, but you also had a little bit of top bezel, but the curved sides made this thing look really good as well. This phone came out about the same year, I think, as the Galaxy S6, so really it didn't look that bad. Now you do have the buttons and everything on the side, micro SD card slot on the back, plastic back, and you do have that single camera setup, which we'll get into right now. Now, surprisingly, this was an 18 megapixel sensor, and it's actually not that bad. 4K at 30. This was again the same year the iPhone 6S Plus, and Galaxy S6 came out, and I think this camera was actually pretty good. I didn't get to test it at that time. Obviously nowadays it's really not that great, but it got the job done for the most part. And again, having 4K at 30, I'm glad it didn't have 1080p. It tapped out at 4K at 30, which I think is a good plus for this phone. The front camera was 2 megapixels, so definitely not the best looking front-facing camera, and it could very well be the downgrade and the downside of picking up this phone nowadays. But that back camera is really not that bad, and I think that's a pretty good advantage of it. So that's really it in the camera sense. It really doesn't need to take 30 minutes talking about it because it's a very old phone now and the camera really isn't that good. But I still like the way this phone looks, and I actually do think that back camera really isn't that bad. So that's a pretty impressive thing in and of itself. Now moving on to potentially, in my opinion, the best thing and the most surprising thing about this phone was actually the OS. Now this thing actually had pretty much stock Android. It didn't really have too many other crazy software inside of it. It had some like Blackberry software inside of it for the most part, but it was a stock version of software. And coming from things like the Blackberry Classic, the Blackberry Passport, and even some other Android phones like the Blackberry Key 1 and stuff, those are more stock. But these ones, like the Blackberry Passport, just was a mess in my opinion. I didn't like it. And this software on this thing, if Blackberry could have just kept making phones like this with this software and some type of design like this with a sliding keyboard, that would have been an amazing feat of technology at that moment, because there's not a lot of phones nowadays that are making such crazy, improvements and crazy designs with phones that as big of a name as Blackberry at that time in 2015, which it wasn't even that big. But the biggest downside of a lot of phones is software, and that's the one thing that manufacturers just need to keep like improving, and they need to keep like downgrading, like with OnePlus. Blackberry at this time had stock Android for the most part, which is so crazy. So this, in my opinion, more than the design itself, was one of the more interesting things. After that keyboard, the stock software was one thing that threw me off. I was expecting some bloated mess. It really wasn't the case, so I think that's a really good thing. But also on top of that, the battery life of this phone was actually pretty good as well. It had a 3,410 mAh battery. Now that is not a small battery even nowadays. I mean, you look at the iPhone like 12 Pro, that has like a 2,800 mAh battery. So this phone from 2015 has a bigger battery than a lot of phones that are still coming out, and it was a pretty good thing. It had wireless charging, which is cool. It had a quick charge, and I think that in and of itself is another massive thing about this phone, and one of the coolest things about it for sure. So that in and of itself is already a pretty cool thing, making this phone seem like somewhat of an impressive phone. Again, it's not like a crazy big deal or anything like that, but it is a pretty impressive phone, especially nowadays when most of the phones that we're getting are pretty stock, they're pretty boring, nothing really crazy. They all kind of do the same thing, to be honest now, 8K on the back. At least this phone in 2015 had a slide out keyboard, and I do think 2015 and 2017 were 2 years, and possibly 2019 as well, but that's kind of a stretch. 2015 and 2017 were years of phones where there's a bunch of different things are moving on, and it's still one of my favorite years of phones for sure. Now let's go and end it off with the performance. This device had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 808 chipset, Hex-core CPU, Adreno 418 GPU, and 3 gigs of RAM. Now here's the thing, this phone, even at that moment, it really wasn't like a crazy great performing phone, but it really wasn't that bad either. Like, this was a pretty decent performing phone at the time. And again, when you have a phone like this, you already know that with a stock software, you're not really going to need anything super crazy in order to kind of like move on with it and kind of, do things with it. That is one of the best advantages of picking up a phone like this with stock software, is that it doesn't really need a crazy amount of performance. It doesn't need a crazy amount of RAM or, the latest chipset to kind of perform and kind of move on. And that's the same exact thing with the other phones like the Pixels of this year and those devices. You don't need the latest chipset to have the, best type of performance. And that, without a doubt, is pretty much the same thing with this phone. Although it isn't like the latest and greatest, although it isn't like the craziest thing, it still is a pretty good performing phone even on the software that it's on. So take it as you will, but that, without a doubt, is a crazy impressive thing to keep in mind. Now on top of that, this type of phone, the performance really isn't that great to begin with anymore, but at that moment in 2015, compared to phones like the Galaxy S6 and the iPhone 6s now, it's really not that bad of a performing phone. It's glitchy all over the place. It stopped at Android 6.0, so obviously it didn't get anything after that. But I do think for a phone that came out at that point, I think it's pretty decent. And I think in this day and age, I'm pretty much impressed by it in terms of a performance standpoint. So in terms of that covers it up there. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, is this phone still worth it in 2021? Well, the short answer is absolutely not. This phone is not worth it at all. And I would advise you all to not buy this phone anymore. It's not worth it in that sense. The only reason this phone is even somewhat intriguing is because of the keyboard. I think this phone's design is actually really impressive, and it is probably one of its strong suits. Just being able to have those slim, bezels kind of at that moment, having a curved display at that point too, which was really, really cool. And having that slide up keyboard, dude, that is crazy, just having that type of capability. But again, it's not perfect. The front camera really isn't that great. It's not a super great performing phone in this day and age, but at that point, it actually wasn't that bad. The phone, only got like one version of software, which is pretty pathetic in my opinion. Nowadays we need way more software versions. Unfortunately, at that moment, I guess it's okay because this phone came out in 2015, but it would have been cool had it got a couple more versions of software. But those are really the main highlights. Other than that, there really isn't like a crazy reason to buy this phone other than like it being kind of like an icon in a way. Other than that, like I said, I just wouldn't probably recommend buying this phone anymore, but it's still a very cool theory. And to be honest, if BlackBerry were to make a phone like this today, like if they were just to be like, hey, we're going to make a BlackBerry Priv 2 or whatever, I would pretty much be interested in to see what they could do. Like, this wasn't a bad phone, and I'd be pretty interested to see what they would do with the next generation. I don't think it's going to be perfect, and if they bring a keyboard in, I would be interested to see how they would implement that. But that pretty much covers it. I'm pretty happy with it. I'm curious to see what, BlackBerry is going to do in the future. That apparently they're not making phones anymore, so that pretty much covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions, leave them link down in the comment section below or type them out. I don't know what you guys do. Hit the like button, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.